Hello, my name is Alice. So, a few months ago, or maybe not so few, a while ago, I made a Homestuck video where I drew all of the, I don't know, the basic Homestuck characters in my style. So, what I mean by basic Homestuck characters is the beta kids, John, Dave, Jade, and Rose, and then all of the 12 trolls that they play with because I'm kind of obsessed with Homestuck right now, and so that's pretty much all I draw at the moment. But in my last Homestuck video, I mentioned that I might make a sequel. Now, at that moment, I was just about to finish Homestuck, like the original series, I think, and I hadn't read the Epilogues or Beyond Canon yet. But now I have consumed pretty much all Homestuck content, excluding Hiveswap. I'm getting to that. And so I decided to make a sequel based on that. At first I was kind of unsure of who to draw, what to draw. I didn't really want to draw all the Before Us trolls or all the Ancestor trolls or anything like that because I just don't know that much about them. But I knew I wanted to draw the Alpha Kids, or, Dirk, Jake, Roxy, and Jane. But then it was like, who's gonna accompany them? I can't make a video of just 4 characters. So, I went a little bit beyond 4 characters or 4 drawings. I fear that this video is gonna be even longer and bigger than the last one. I know the opinions on Epilogues and Beyond Canon are kind of torn in the fandom, and I won't discuss that here in the intro, but I'll definitely touch upon that in the video. But basically, what I decided to do for this video is draw the Alpha Kids first as how they first appeared in the comic, so when they were like 15, 16 something, and then I will draw them and the beta kids and 2 of the trolls in the meat and the candy timeline. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but if you don't, it's okay, you'll see what I mean. But yeah, basically in this video I want to kind of experiment with the contrasts and differences in characters based on age and based on which timeline we're depicting. So if you want to see that, stick around! Also, this video will obviously contain very heavy spoilers for both the Epilogues and Beyond Canon, and the end, probably, of original Homestuck. So if you haven't read them, or if you're like planning to read them, or you don't want to be spoiled for whatever reason, don't stick around. Watch this later when you've read it all, because I will spoil everything. I will spoil everything up until the current point of Beyond Canon that is relevant to these characters. So, yeah, spoiler warning, you have now been warned. Let's get into the video. Also, on a side note, if you haven't read Beyond Canon or the Epilogues, this might get confusing too. Just so you're aware of that, because I mentioned some stuff that I don't explain because I just kind of assume you've read it if you're watching this video. So yeah, just putting that out there. So, we're starting with designing the Alpha Kids, because I didn't do that in the last video, I only did the Beta Kids. So, we're starting with Jane, and again, keep in mind they're supposed to be about like 15, 16 here when I draw them. Also, keep in mind this video is unscripted, so if I start to ramble or talk incoherently, that's why. But anyway, I really liked Jane when she was first introduced into the comic. I think she's really cute, and she liked baking, and I like baking, so I can relate to that. There's also a lot of references in Homestuck to her possibly being like bigger or chubbier or whatever, and I really liked that thought, so I kept that in. Now you'll see I put her next to John and Jade as kind of reference. The height I draw for her maybe won't stick into the end of the video, I didn't actually do measurements. I just did eye measurements. I don't really care what exact height the character has, but yeah, whatever. Anyway, as I said, I really liked Jane in the beginning of the comic. She did gradually become a little corrupt by Crocker Corp, but at the same time, I can't fully blame her for that because she grew up brainwashed. She literally grew into that basically cult, so I can't fully blame her for how it kind of affects her down the line. But that being said, I've seen a lot of people kind of complain about how she was portrayed in the epilogues and beyond canon, and how to them, she just seemingly kind of turned evil out of nowhere. I don't agree with this at all. I do agree that some parts of the epilogues and beyond canon are a little dramatic and a little much sometimes, especially in the early stages. But I do think that Jane's storyline makes sense, because I picked up on a lot of things I read in the original Homestuck comic, specifically in how she treated Jake. I found it kind of creepy how she was like determined that this is gonna be my husband, kind of almost no matter what he says or what I think. And also there was a reference to her planning to literally like roofie him, which that disturbed me because, you know, they were just teenagers. And based on those two things alone, I feel like in the most extreme scenario, the way she turned out in the epilogues and in Beyond Canon just makes sense, because she's always had those tendencies of like, life is supposed to turn out a certain way for me, and if they don't, I'll make it, you know? And that is most likely something, like a mindset, that she inherited from Crocker Corp. And again, it's not entirely her fault that she was basically brainwashed by them. Definitely not. But I do think when she does become an adult in the epilogues and beyond canon, it does become her responsibility to kind of distance herself from that. And she doesn't choose to do that. So obviously that's a problem, and I do feel like that's a problem that would happen to her character. So I do feel, at least to some extent, that the way she turns out in the epilogues and everything, that it makes sense for her character. Now, I didn't mean to start rambling about the epilogues and beyond canon already, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of say that I think there were traces of that already in original Homestuck. Besides those things, there's a scene that really sticks out for me where I felt so incredibly sorry for Jane. It was a scene where Caliborn was just bullying her about her weight, and then just telling her that her dad was dead, and basically just kind of making her freak out very understandably and just break down. And I felt so incredibly sorry for her in that moment. I think the end, like the last act of Homestuck did, I know a lot of people critique that too, but I think it did a great job of showing that these are just kids going through very traumatic things, and although it's shown obviously in a more like humorous light, it's still very apparent that they're very affected and shaken by all the things they go through, which is very understandable. But yeah, I just think Jane is a great example of that. In that moment where she was talking about to Caliborn about like she was just having a good moment with Roxy and he just ruined it. I feel like that's something that a lot of girls sadly can relate to, how like you're just living your life, having a good time, and then a man ruins it, essentially. But yeah, that got dark. But yeah, here's Jane as a teen. I think she's really cute. I love I don't love Crocker Corp, but I do love the red color, and I love it with her blue. I think it looks great. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, so next up is Jane, but in the Meet timeline in Beyond Canon. So for the most part, I'm going to try to draw these characters how they were recently, like most recently shown in the comic. So at this point, when I draw her, Jane is about like, I think 25, 26, something like that. And she is on the ship with Roxy, Callie, Dave, Karkat, Jade. I might have forgotten someone, I don't know. Oh my god, Kanaya! I forgot about Kanaya. Okay, sorry. But basically, at this point, due to the retcon that happened in one of the most recent updates of Beyond Canon, Jane was put on the ship with the gang to go and fight Dirk, and she seems to be doing a little better and less evil, seemingly, than she did previously. So she's kind of left her presidential position, and went on the hunt for Dirk. So, the outfit they put her in, I think is really cute, and I do rejoice in the fact that they finally decided to draw her, bigger, because I do feel like it is implied that she is, like plus size, and it's so important for that to show in comic form. Like, I understand in like sprite form you can't really show that because all sprites kind of follow the same mold, but I think it's great that now that they've developed the art style a little, that they can show her chubby, and I really love that. And I think she's really cute, and obviously we don't really know much about how she is as a person in this very like recently retconned skip thing. We don't know if she's maybe like changed her mind about stuff, or if she was just brought on because Roxy wanted her there, or whatever it might be, but she does seem to get along with the others, so I do have hope in my heart that she is better. Also, me and my girlfriend is kind of an OG Homestuck fan. Not really OG, but like 2014 OG. Just wanted to put that out there before you call me uneducated. But basically the scene with Jane and Jaspros, oh my god, my girlfriend and me like fucking freaked out over that scene. We love that scene. Oh my god. 1, 2, 3, I want Yuri! But anyway, I love this outfit that they put her in. I love the red with the blue again. It just really pops for me. I love it so much, and I think it fits her so well. And I don't know much about what to say about her other than that, considering again we haven't really seen her after the retcon like talk, or how she's perceived by the others or anything, so it's kind of hard to gather information based on that. But again, it does seem that she's in a better place than she was earlier, and that she is in the candy timeline. So that makes me happy for her, and it makes me hope for a Jane redemption, at least in this timeline. Because I do really like Jane as a character, and I would really like to see her get better. Again, I do think her turning, quote, like evil, or like basically into a dictator, I do think it fits her character and the way she was raised and all of her experiences, but that doesn't mean I don't want to see her develop into a better person. I don't think everyone necessarily needs that character development. It's more realistic if some people just stay bad or whatever, because that's just how the world tends to work. But I would like to see Jane redeemed somewhat, because I do feel like she has potential to be a really good person. And from what I've seen of like John's, Nana, like that version of her, she seems really sweet. I mean, I don't know, maybe she's an asshole. I have no idea, but she seems really sweet, and I think that's a good like taste of what Jane could be if she actually realized that, she has some issues and worked on those issues. And I think that goes for a lot of the characters. I think you'll hear throughout this video that a lot of the characters I like, a lot of things that happen in Beyond Canon, I like because I feel like it fits their character, but I don't necessarily, or I don't actually approve of like morally. But yeah, here is Meet Jane. I love her. I think she is the favorite version of her that I've drawn out of the three versions I drew. So, yeah. So now it's of course time for Candy Jane. Now, I immediately decided to make her a little thinner than Meet Jane because I feel like one, she's drawn that way, and two, I feel like it just tell me if this is problematic to say, but I think it fits her if she's like evil to be a little skinnier. I don't know. I just want to go against the stereotype that, you know, fat people are evil or whatever. And also I feel like, you know, maybe she doesn't take care of herself as much in that timeline because there's a lot of stress on her with her being an evil dictator and a girl boss and everything, and dealing with the whole Jake situation, the whole Gamsey situation. I don't even want to talk about that, to be honest. But that being said, she does look like a baddie. Not because she's thinner, but because her outfit is slay. And I really like the detail. I think this is something that is present in other characters as well. But that as she kind of gets overtaken by this Crocker Corp mentality of being a dictator, you know, determining what other people are supposed to think and feel and everything, that her outfits turns completely red and black and all the blue disappears. The only like blue that is left, and so the only remaining fragment of like who she used to be that is left is in her eye color, because she can't change her eye color, obviously. That is just so good to me. Like, I love that, you know, in the other universe where she's clearly maybe more herself, she has both blues and reds, as she has had since she was a kid. But here, where she's kind of gone full dictator mode, I would say this is like the most extreme she can be. Like the ultimate culmination of all her bad traits, essentially, that she's in all red and black. That the blue has just completely disappeared. I love that. I think that is great, like color coding and character design and everything. I love that. And I think there are a lot of clever things like that in Beyond Canon that people tend to kind of ignore. And I don't want you guys to think I'm just sitting here glazing the shit out of the epilogues and Beyond Canon. They definitely have their flaws, but I do think that it really picked up after they kind of changed team and had a long hiatus and everything. Like, the recent updates I think have been great, and honestly I think the general story of especially Beyond Canon has been amazing. And like, I know a lot of people don't agree with me, and that's fine, but I love it. I think, you know, a bunch of traumatized kids turning into broken adults, I think that's like the most realistic thing there is. And I don't think most of the characters are out of character. I think they've just changed with age and with circumstance. And I think Jane is a prime example of that. I mean, in the Me timeline right now, she seems to be doing a lot better. She has her blue color, she's with her friends, she seems to be having fun. She's working towards kind of a team mentality goal instead of just I decide everything goal. She's going against the brainwashing that Crocker Corp has put her through since childhood. And so she turns into a better person. Her good traits take over. Meanwhile, here in the Candy timeline, she is a dictator, and she has slowly been corrupted and let herself be consumed by this mentality that Crocker Corp has kind of instilled in her. Basically, that she's supposed to lead everyone, she's supposed to control everyone, and her politics become just more and more extreme. And I think this is a great thing to have in a comic, especially considering how the world is right now. I think it's great representation and a great example of how someone that might be a good person in their very foundation can be corrupted by the system and by how they were raised. So really, I love the way that Jane turns out in both timelines, because I think it shows potential. It shows what would she do if she was driven to an extreme and all of her bad traits kind of took over, or what would she do if she kind of worked on those bad traits and she was surrounded by a good support system and she allowed herself to kind of change and move away from that mentality. What would happen then? I think that's what's so interesting about Beyond Canon, right? So, and I think like Jane is one of the characters that kind of embodies that the most. So yeah, I'm really pleased with how all the Janes turned out. I again especially like the meat one. I think she's really cute, and I think it's the closest to how I picture her grown up, and how I picture her, like what she would look like if she could actually choose and let herself shine through instead of letting Crocker Corp and the Condas shine through. So, yeah, let's move on to the next character. So, the next character we're going to talk about is Jake English. Right off the bat, I'm just gonna say it, I don't like him. I don't like him, and I do not dislike him in, like, I think he's poorly written or anything. I just dislike him because of his personality. No offense to Jake lovers out there. Keep loving him. I just don't. So yeah, my first impression of Jake English was that he was annoying. I don't like the type of men who are like, oh, I love adventure. I want adventure all the time. I don't care about anyone else. I just want to feel like a hero. You know, I cannot stand those personality types. That's just a personal ick of mine. And that's just how it is. I think Jake is a greatly written character in that, like, there exists a lot of men like him, I fear. But yeah, I don't like him. That being said, he is very fun to read. When me and my girlfriend, and later me and my friends, are reading and going to read Homestuck, I'm the voice of him. And I always do this really poor British accent and this very like type of voice, because I imagine that John has kind of inherited it from him. So yeah, he's very fun to read, and I think he says a lot of fun stuff, and that's about as many positive things as I can say about him. However, I do love how complex he is, even though he very much isn't a complex personality, if you know what I mean. Because, like, I would say Jake's biggest flaw, and I'm not alone to have noticed this, obviously, it's glaringly obvious. Jake can never take accountability. He can never realize he's wrong and then work on himself and move on. That is not something he is capable of doing. Or, of course, actually, fuck it. Of course he's capable of doing it. He just doesn't want to. And that enrages me. But at the same time, I love it because it is something that a lot of people, especially men, oh my god, I'm so aggressive. Wait, calm down. It's a trait that a lot of people, and especially a lot of men, exhibit. Jake is someone who has a lot of, I would say, weaponized incompetence. He is perceived as very dumb and naive by a lot of people, but I don't think he is for even a second. I do believe he can be overly ambitious sometimes, and obviously he is the aspect of hope, which for him means that if something is not to his liking, he just hopes really hard that it will change. But that's the thing about him. He never calls to action. He never actually does anything to make things change. Instead, he just sits and hopes that someone else will do it for him. And that's the weaponized incompetence. He isn't incompetent. He isn't dumb. He understands what people say. When people explain to him that they're hurt by him or that he's doing something wrong, he understands completely what they mean, but he plays dumb and he pretends not to understand so that they'll get tired and move on and he won't have to deal with it. And it disgusts me. It really does. But again, it is a very it's a very realistic trait for him to have, sadly. A lot of people have this trait. And it makes even more sense considering he was raised alone, you know, in the jungle. He won't have had much socialization. And so most likely when he was met with socialization for the first time in his life, he was like, it's so complicated, I don't want to deal with this, basically. And you know what? Fuck him for that. That's not okay. And this is where I get kind of mad when people try to defend him when it comes to him and Dirk. Obviously, I'll talk more about his and Dirk's relationship when I come to the Dirk part of the video. But a lot of people tend to act like Dirk is a perpetrator in the relationship and Jake is just completely innocent. When in reality, I think they're both fucked up. I do believe that Jake, in a lot of situations, are a victim, but at the same time he's not completely innocent. I feel like people kind of miss the fact that you can be treated poorly by people and also treat people poorly. You can be a victim and a perpetrator at the same time, and people don't seem to be able to understand that, and that upsets me. But yeah, obviously we'll talk more about that as I draw his other versions. But yeah, so in conclusion, I don't like Jake. I think he's an asshole, but he is, I think, a very well-written character, and I think he's a very realistic character in that sadly I see people like him in the real world all the time. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, meet Jake. So I hate his outfit. I really do. It's the ugliest thing. I felt nauseous while drawing it. No, but for real, like, sadly, I feel it is something he would wear, but I hate it so much. He looks like an abstract shape. Okay. Okay. But anyway. So, in the meet route in Beyond Canon, Jake, after the retcon, goes together with a bunch of his friends to fight Dirk, his ex. And again, just like with Jane, we don't really know much about how that came to be and what in this like retcon thing changed it so that they're now on the ship. Like, we don't really know what his motives for being there are. But he's there, and he seems to be bonding with the others, especially Karkat, and him seems to have kind of formed a friendship of some sort, which I think is kind of cute. But that being said, there's a lot of discussion surrounding Jake, both Jake in original Homestuck, and Jake now that he's an adult in the Epilogues and Beyond Canon. And the discussion is basically whether he is a victim of like sexual harassment, and I think yes, he definitely is. This has also been a part of Jake's character from the beginning, where a lot of other characters are attracted to him in different ways, whether it be that they just think he's attractive, or whether it be that they just like Dirk are almost a little obsessed with him. And a lot of the time he doesn't really understand where this attraction is coming from, and I don't think doesn't really share it. A lot of people headcanon him as like arrow ace, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't say it's a headcanon that I 100% agree with, or that I 100% associate him with. Okay, pause. When I say I don't agree with it, I don't mean that I think it's wrong in any way, shape, or form. I just mean that I don't personally headcanon that. But just wanted to make sure I wasn't misconstrued there. But I do definitely see like the correlations, so it's definitely not something I'm opposed to, because it is very obvious that Jake isn't in love. To me, at least, it's obvious. I must say, to me, this is my headcanon. I think it's very obvious in original Homestuck that Jake isn't in love with any of his friends. I don't think he's in love with Dirk, who he ends up getting together with. I think he has attraction for him, That's my headcanon. I think he is attracted to him, but I don't think he's in love with him. I think he's just attracted to the appeal of a relationship and, well, the adventure that it offers. And I think a lot of the time, people sexualize him and they see him, because they see him as kind of stupid and they think he's attractive at the same time, they almost see him a little bit as a sex object. And I think obviously that's disgusting. You shouldn't view a person like that, especially not in original Homestuck where he was only a teen. And Jake is kind of using this sexuality or people's attraction to his body as a way of like getting views, getting followers, I don't know, supporters, like on TV and stuff like that. And I do definitely think he knows what he's doing when he's like, I don't know, shoving his butt up to the camera or whatever the fuck he was described doing. However, I also think this is something that he has noted gains him attention, and so this is something he does, which I don't necessarily think is a good thing always. Like, you can be don't get me wrong, you can be as sexy as you want on TV, but if it comes from a place of like, this is the only way I know how to get attention, then it becomes a little bit sad, you know? And again, I don't think Jake is dumb, and I think this, should I say, act of like him kind of using people's attraction to him as a means of like drawing in views and kind of playing like stupid about it and like as if he doesn't understand what's happening, I think that, you know, comes from the way that he notices that people view him. I feel like I'm just rambling and it isn't making sense, but yeah. Essentially, I feel like people have definitely treated him wrong, and he has definitely treated other people wrong too. And I do really appreciate the inclusion of a male character that kind of gets sexually harassed and treated in a way that's not okay, because when it comes to men, stuff like that isn't really taken seriously, and I think it definitely should be. So yeah, once again, the conclusion is that Jake English is a very complicated character, and I don't like him, but he is a pretty deep character nonetheless. It is a character that you would surface level kind of see and react kind of how the characters in Homestuck react. You know, like, oh, this dude is dumb, but he isn't, and I think that's really interesting to work with. Now we move on to Candy Jake. This version of Jake, I'm gonna talk about him, and I think I need to put a trigger warning for mentions of essay and just those kinds of themes. So if you're not comfortable with listening to that, I think you'd better just kind of skip this part. But yeah, Candy Jake, I would say, just as Candy Jane is the culmination of like her worst traits and how she would turn out if all of those things just spring into action, I think this is his version of that as well. This is all of Jake's like bad traits just really biting him in the ass, I would say. So essentially, in the Candy timeline, Jake ends up in a relationship with Jane. They get married, I believe, and they have a kid. Now, it is heavily implied that Jake, this isn't entirely consensual. Jake is basically being sexually assaulted by Jane, and she's a very abusive partner to him. And it doesn't seem like he's great to her either, but it seems that she is the main aggressor, if I have, you know, read into it correctly. Also, Gamzee is involved, and I don't want to talk about that. Frankly, I don't want to talk about Gamzee. Fuck Gamzee. We pretend he doesn't exist here, okay? But that being cleared up, this version of Jake, it's just sad, in my opinion. Like, it is him being in a really terrible situation and kind of trying to get out, but at the same time not. It's obviously I do not blame him for being in an abusive marriage. It can happen to literally anyone, and it's never the victim's fault. But I got to say that with Jake's personality, he is a person that, again, when it comes to his aspect, hope, he embodies it through instead of like seeing a situation he doesn't like and working with his hope into making his dreams a reality. He just kind of stands aside and waits for the situation to get better. He literally just hopes for the situation to get better without actively trying to do anything about it. And I think that's what happens in this situation. He gets stuck in this really terrible marriage. His son is being used and abused as well as him, and instead of leaving his wife, because he does understand that this is a bad situation, like we see several times where he kind of steps aside and he realizes that this is a bad situation. Despite it all, he keeps going back to her, and he never really leaves. He never really does anything to save his son from this situation. There's a scene where his son is dying of a peanut allergy because Yancy keeps giving him peanuts because he's a bitch. And he actually uses his hope powers to save him, and that is, to my knowledge, the first time he actually uses his powers actively to do something. And I think that's the first time he really realizes that, hey, I can actually do something with these powers. Because previously, he just hasn't cared enough to do anything. And again, I don't blame him for being stuck in this abusive marriage. I understand that that's a situation that's incredibly difficult to get out of. But at the same time, he does realize it's wrong, and he doesn't do anything to save his son from it. It isn't until like recently in Beyond Canon that he has started fighting Jane. And I applaud him for that. I definitely do. So, conclusion, yes, he's a victim. He's definitely a victim. I feel really sorry for him for the situation he's been put in. But at the same time, I also have to bring up the fact that he is not a great parent to his son, because he doesn't help him out of this abusive situation. He doesn't give him the help that he needs. And yeah, it's a mix of him being in a bad situation and his bad traits keeping him and his son in that situation. But yeah, that being said, again, it got really heavy. Here is Candy Jake. I think I like him most out of the designs I did. Just because, sorry, but he looks really ugly in the other ones. But yeah, final conclusions here. I dislike Jake. I dislike his personality. I think he has great depth, and I think I would require a lot more time to properly discuss everything about him and a lot of the other characters. But yeah, here he is, so let's move on. So next up is Roxy. Now, Roxy, I first of all, I love him. Love. But secondly, Roxy is kind of a difficult character to refer to, because they essentially use different pronouns in all different timelines, kind of. Basically, in original Homestuck, Roxy was referred to as she, her, although it was kind of hinted that they hadn't gone through any sort of personal journey, which, you know, kind of alludes to the fact that they might go through a personal journey of some sort. And then later in the epilogues, they start identifying as non-binary in one of the timelines, in the meat timeline. Meanwhile, in the Candy timeline, they keep the she, her pronouns, although they make it very clear that they don't feel particularly cisgender, I would say. So, how have I solved this? Essentially, to be safe, I will refer to Roxy as they, them when I draw them as a teenager and when I draw them in the Candy timeline. Now, in both these timelines, they use she, her pronouns, but I think it is like the series has made it sure enough that they're not actually like a cis woman, so I'm going to say they, them, just to kind of be safe. And then when I draw them in the meat timeline, I will refer to them as he, him, because those are the pronouns he uses in that timeline. So if I ever slip up during this video because it's all just a little bit confusing, I'm sorry, I do not mean to. I will correct myself to the best of my ability. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's get into Roxy's character. So as mentioned, I think Roxy is really cute. They are a really cheerful person, and I always do kind of like those characters. I also really like their like pink cat theme they got going on. Now, obviously, from the get-go, Roxy's biggest issue in the beginning is that they are an alcoholic, which is something that their biological daughter, Rose, also inherited, which is, of course, sad. However, although this is something that obviously affects Roxy's character and how they speak, and how they kind of act in the beginning of Homestuck, I wouldn't say this is something that affects their personality that much. I would say they are very similar when they're drunk as when they're sober, aside from like slurred speech and stuff like that, obviously. And of course, in the epilogues and beyond canon, they seem to be pretty much clean of alcohol, so that's very nice to see. They also have the most adorable relationship with Calliope, who I sadly will not draw in this video, but I love Calliope, they're so cute. But as much as I love Roxy, I also have to point out their flaws, like with everyone else. So I would say, aside from being an alcoholic, Roxy's biggest issue is that they cannot stand for what they think, always. Or, okay, let me rephrase. They stand for what they think, except when it goes against their friends. And that's obviously a huge issue. Because if your friend is, for example, racist, or in Jane's case, xenophobic, and you just kind of stand silently by, going, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be, you know, you are also xenophobic, and you're also perpetuating the problem by proxy. And I would say that is one of Roxy's biggest issue. They cannot take a stance against their friends. They are very loyal and kind of loyal above all, which of course can be seen as very like, you know, them being a very good friend, but I think sometimes it can turn problematic, and I think their relationship with Jane is a very good example of that, where Jane had to go so incredibly far before Roxy could finally be like, okay, maybe Jane is a little far gone. And keep in mind, by then she had gone completely, like, totally dictator, I started a war, you know. And yeah, I would say that's Roxy's biggest flaw. They can't go against their friends, which makes them problematic in that way. And I think this is something that is very much present in Dave as well, since they're related, that in his case he can't really stand up for himself. Instead, he can't, he doesn't really dare to admit things about himself. Meanwhile, with Roxy, they can't, they don't dare to admit things about their friends. So I think that's a very interesting connection. But yeah, let's move on and explore Roxy in the meat and candy timelines. So, meet Roxy. I don't know if this opinion is considered a hot take in the fandom or something, but I sincerely think that Meet Roxy is the truest form of Roxy, and I don't necessarily mean pertaining to his like gender identity. like, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to judge whether him being like identifying as non-binary and him identifying as a man, like, I don't feel like I'm in a place to say what is more authentic to him, but I feel like where he is in his life, like on the ship with his friends, like having ditched his old hoodie, having found more of, you know, his style, I really feel like Roxy has found himself, or at least begun to find himself. That this journey that he has taken of like self-discovery has really paid off. And then, I don't know, he might find himself with other pronouns, or, you know, find out other things about himself in the future that we don't know about yet. But like, for now, I do feel like he's in a good place. Now, as previously mentioned, we don't really know why Jane is on the ship, why like Jane and Jake, but I would say primarily Jane is on the ship, considering her history with, you know, being xenophobic and all. And I do kind of fear that Roxy may have been the strongest contributor, if not the sole contributor, to the fact that she's there. And that obviously points to that part of Roxy's character not being that developed, like that he hasn't really worked on, you know, standing up to his friends. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he has stood up to Jane and convinced her to go on the ship and be a better person. I don't know, we don't know. But that is something I would like to see Roxy work on, or at least address, or something to be called out from other characters, because I feel like that's a pretty big part of his character as well. But again, his new outfit and everything, I love to see it. I love to see Roxy thriving throughout everything. I feel like in both timelines, Roxy is the person that is doing the best, even though Roxy is by no means doing amazing. It's just everyone else is doing so incredibly bad in at least one of the timelines that it's just like, whoa. But I do love the fact that even though Roxy identifies as a man in the Meet timeline, that he has found his way back to feminine, more like feminine presenting clothing, because I do feel that Roxy is a very feminine person, not pertaining to his gender necessarily, but to the way he like to fashion and stuff like that. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with men being feminine. Men can be just as feminine as women can be. And I think it's great representation for, obviously I can't say I'm not trans, but from my point of view anyway, I would say that I'm very happy to see a trans man being feminine, because I've seen many trans men on social platforms express that they want to dress more feminine, but they don't dare to because they're scared of people perceiving them as women, which I understand is a very valid concern, and therefore I'm very happy for this representation where a trans man has the courage and feels comfortable enough around his people that he can actually present feminine without worrying about people perceiving him as a woman. I don't know, it's just really refreshing for me to see, because I've seen that being an issue in real life. And really, when it comes to stuff like that, representation really matters. Like, it really, really, really does. I mean, I know as a queer person, seeing other queer characters, as if I'm a character or something, queer representation in media really helped me with realizing at a very young age that being gay and being queer is okay, and that there's nothing wrong with me for being queer. So yeah, I'm very happy for Roxy, and I've seen some people complain that like he identifies differently in different timelines. Personally, I don't think that necessarily has to be a bad thing. I think just like sexuality can be fluid for some people, I think gender expression can definitely be fluid for some people. And whether Roxy identifying as a woman in one timeline and a man in the other means that they are gender fluid, or if it just means that they just haven't found themselves yet in one or both maybe of the timelines, remains to be seen. But in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with a person identifying differently based on their circumstances. I think identity in all of its forms is usually affected to some degree by your environment. I'm not like saying if you grew up around gay people you're gonna turn gay or anything like that, but I'm just saying maybe in a universe, if you grew up around a lot of homophobia, it would take you a lot longer to find your gay identity than if you grew up with a bunch of accepting gay people, for example. Okay, I've rambled on for a little too long, so let's move on. But yeah, final thoughts. I love this version of Roxy. I think this is my favorite. I think he's super cute. I love his outfit. And I love that the cap motif is still going strong. So yeah, let's move on. And now we are going to talk about Candy Roxy. So Candy Roxy still goes by she, her pronouns, although they have expressed, I think, very clearly, both in the epilogues and later in Beyond Canon, where they and John kind of talk about their marriage and talk about identity and everything, that they do not feel comfortable as being like perceived as a woman, if that makes sense. Like they don't feel comfortable with viewing their body as a woman's body, but they have found comfort in pregnancy and motherhood or parenthood, and has realized that the way people perceive them doesn't really matter, but that it is the way they perceive themselves that matters. So obviously this can be perceived in a lot of different ways. You can interpret it as, oh, they've basically, you know, they're someone's mom, they've been a wife, you know, they've been put into these traditional female roles, and therefore they maybe feel like shackled to those constraints of like, but I don't want to like lose my identity as a mother, or, you know, and so they choose to keep identifying as a woman even though they know they're not. Or you can interpret it as, you know, Roxy maybe being like non-binary but still going with feminine, or not feminine, but she, her pronouns, and being content in that. And I don't think either of those takes are wrong. I feel like, again, I think for some people gender is a very fluid thing, and it's, I think, seldom something that can be very clearly defined for a lot of people. So maybe Roxy is just one of those people where they find that, okay, well, I'm comfortable being a mother, and so I'm comfortable being perceived as a woman, or people using she, her pronouns, as long as I know who I am. Like, I know that I'm not a cis woman, but I'm fine with those pronouns, and I'm fine with being a mother. Or maybe they just haven't found themselves yet, and that's also okay. So I think it's really interesting, and I think it's a great thing to explore, especially when we have the contrast of them identifying as a man in the other universe. I also think that exploring pregnancy in relation to trans people, or specifically like trans men, or AFAB trans people, is a really interesting conversation to go with, because there are AFAB trans people that don't identify as women who still are very comfortable in being pregnant and are still comfortable being called mom and stuff like that. And again, gender is very fluid and can be defined for some people, so it's completely fine. And I think that is also a good and interesting angle to bring up. But enough about Roxy's gender. I will not talk anymore about that. That's not all they are. I also want to talk about the glaring issue in this timeline of Roxy defending Jane to the ends of the earth. And look, I understand that they've been besties since childhood, and I understand it can be incredibly difficult to realize when a family member or a close friend has turned extreme in like their political stance or their political opinions or just their ethics overall. Like, I understand it is a difficult topic and it is a difficult thing to comprehend that someone you love that much can be a bad person. But I think Roxy pushes it to the extreme, and that is the one thing about them that I'm like, you know? Because when everyone else who has known Jane from the beginning, including Jake, who is literally, I think, married to her in this timeline, or at least together with her in this timeline, admits that, like, Jane is going way too far, we need to stop her, and Roxy's still like, oh, but she's my Janie, she's my best friend. It's like, okay, you need to calm down. Like, you need to realize that your best friend is literally a dictator, and she started a war, and she is quite literally trying to erase trolls. Like, hello. So that's definitely something I feel like that's Roxy's biggest weakness, I would say, in every timeline, but especially the Candy timeline, is where they're pushed to the very extremes of this weakness of theirs, where they defend Jane until they literally can't anymore. And obviously that does make Roxy into a worse person, because you can't support someone that has vile opinions and be like neutral because you like them. Like, stuff like that doesn't fly. If you support someone who's racist, homophobic, whatever, you are actively pushing racism and homophobia, whether you want to or not. And that is something that I hear a lot of discussions about in real life too. Like, oh, but I'm neutral to politics. I don't care what my friends have. Like, friendship transcends politics. In my opinion, no. If you are friends with a Trump supporter and you don't support Trump, or you're like, no, I'm willing to overlook it, no, then you are actively supporting Trump. Like, it's not okay. It makes you a worse person. You have to set your foot down when it comes to ethics and human rights and stuff like that. Like, your morals have to match at least somewhat for you to be friends, I think. But yeah, I've overstepped the time again. I think Roxy's character just brings up a lot of interesting conversations, and I really like Roxy a lot. But yes, let's move on. Okay, so now we've officially reached the last Alpha Kid, Dirk. Now, Dirk is one of my girlfriend's favorite characters. He's definitely not mine. I don't like him whatsoever. I think he has, he's very interesting, and he has a very interesting dynamic with Jake, but I don't like him. So I think when it comes to Dirk, he is very tied to his aspect, heart. I think he knows himself very well, or at least he likes to think that he knows himself very well, and he cannot possibly strive from that. I think what makes him kind of stand out among the other characters is that typically the other characters have like one, obviously they have more flaws than one, but I would say they have maybe one flaw that really like sticks out and defines who they are as a person, and it is like stands to work as like their main challenge. Like, for example, with Roxy, how they keep supporting their friends no matter what, and like with Jane, that she's kind of controlled by Crocker Corp, and that mentality is just kind of haunting her. Whereas with Dirk, I feel like he has a lot of issues, but I would say his primary one is that he thinks that he knows himself so well that he's like, this is who I am and I cannot change. So if he sees any flaw with himself, or if he finds any weakness, he's not like, okay, let's work on this, or how can I maybe work to lessen this or something like that. He's just like, no, that's who I am. I can't change it. And I think that's his biggest issue. He's kind of like, okay, this is who I am. It's unchangeable. If I'm a horrible person, then I'm a horrible person, you know? And this eventually leads him in Beyond Canon into becoming a horrible person. Because to him, it's like, well, this was bound to happen. I was bound to be this like terrible person and do these terrible things to people. It doesn't affect me because it's who I am. Meanwhile, I think if he would have worked on himself, maybe he wouldn't have turned out like that. And I think this is something that is explored in a very interesting way in the game Pester Quest. I don't know if the people watching have played that, so spoiler warning, but essentially in the game, Dirk from Beyond Canon, like when he had in the Meat timeline where he has, you know, gone to Deltrius, I think it's called, his new planet, and become this almost like anime villain-esque person. He confronts himself in the past from when he was still a teen and he was still living alone on Earth. And you kind of get to choose whether he resists himself or whether he chooses to go his own path. And I think it's really interesting to like kind of compare Dirk in Beyond Canon versus how he was when everything began. Because I do think he has the ability to turn quote-unquote evil, even when it all began. But I definitely think if he would just like look at himself and work on himself, he could escape that. And I feel like Pester Quest kind of suggests that maybe he could. Of course, Dirk's quality of like knowing himself very well can also be a positive thing. Being sure of yourself and being confident in who you are obviously can be very positive and can be a great thing for self-confidence and for self-worth. But you also have to be able to change. You have to allow yourself to change. Even if, like, you're very confident where you are, there's always room to develop as a person. And I think, again, that's his biggest flaw, and that's, I think, what would be the key if we were to give Dirk an ending where he wasn't evil or whatever. I think that would be the key for that. But I don't think he ever would, is the thing. So, yeah, I think he's an interesting person, but I think he's such an asshole, and I don't like him. But yeah, let's move on. So in the meat route, Dirk basically abandons all his friends and steals a ship from Jake and steals Rose, makes her into a robot, and then goes towards a planet together with Rose and Teresi. And his intentions are to get to this new planet, develop a new species, and then force some chosen individuals from that species to play Spurb. For what reason, I don't know, or I don't remember. But it's like a very standard evil plan anyway. Me drawing him, it hurt me physically. I was in pain. I hate this outfit. It's terrible. It's very him, so I'm not like complaining about them giving him an outfit like this, because he would definitely wear an outfit like this, I fear. But it kind of hurt to draw, that's all I'm trying to say. So this timeline is basically the correct or canon timeline. According to Dirk, he has had this almost like awakening or something, which is tied to his aspect. And he can basically kind of get into people's heads or get into their hearts, I suppose. Because as far as I understand, the thing that Dirk and Rose goes through, where they kind of almost wake up and become what they call gods, in that they can kind of, infiltrate people's thoughts and whatever. I understand it as Dirk has the aspect of heart, which means that he knows himself very well, as previously discussed. But this also means that he can see, this is my understanding, that he can see and understand what other people want as well, and kind of almost get into their heads and make them pursue that. A prime example of this is obviously the scene with Dave and Karkat, where Dirk essentially makes Dave kiss Karkat because he can sense that that's what Dave wants to do but doesn't dare to do. And so he's like, you should do this thing because this thing is something you want to do. And like Loki kind of tries to force him to do it. And I think this is the thing, right? Dirk, again, knows himself very well. He likes to think he does. He thinks everyone should pursue what they want to do. They should do what's true to them. And he sees Dave, who, Dave is his biological son, and he's like, you should pursue what you want. You're my spawn. That's what I would do, essentially. And is very disappointed that he doesn't. And this is something I find very interesting, because I do think what with him and Roxy being biologically related to Dave and Rose, I think it's very interesting to see that I would say that Roxy is more like Dave and Dirk is more like Rose. They share a lot of traits, because Dave and Roxy are more, rambly and kind of say a bunch of nonsense when they get nervous and stuff like that. And although Dave can be very, stoic, he still rants and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Rose is very much more, cool and controlled, which I feel she gets from Dirk. Rose also, not to talk about other characters while I'm drawing Dirk, but it kind of has to do with him. I would say Rose and Dirk are both the type of people to prioritize their own wants and needs before everyone else's. And this doesn't mean that they can't be empathetic or can help someone else. It just means that they do primarily what is most beneficial to themselves. Meanwhile, I would say that Roxy and Dave, they do care a lot about other people, but they both have trouble doing what they actually want sometimes. Meanwhile, Dirk and Rose, I would say, do that all the time. They do exactly what they want and feel like at pretty much all the time. Meanwhile, Roxy and Dave have more problems with that, because Roxy, as we have mentioned, has a hard time standing up against their friends if they don't agree with them. And I would say Dave has a lot of trouble doing what Dirk does all the time and preaches about, doing what he feels like doing. He has a lot of constraints in the form of self-doubt. And again, that's a weakness that Dirk sees in him that he doesn't like, that he doesn't think that Rose has. Rose is way more sure of herself and what she wants than Dave is. And I think that's why Dirk is so infatuated with her and decided to do this whole ship journey with her, because she's the most like him, but yeah, it's very interesting anyway. But yeah, here he is. I hate the outfit. There's not much more to say about it. Let's move on. So Candy, Root, Dirk was kind of hard for me to draw. Because, well, I have to put a trigger warning here first and foremost. I will be mentioning themes of suicide when talking about him in this timeline for obvious reasons. So if you're not comfortable with listening to that, you can skip to this timestamp. But yeah, so obviously it was kind of hard to draw Candy Dirk because I didn't know what outfit to put him in, because, well, he commits, you could say, in the epilogues, and then is dead and doesn't exist anymore. And obviously the epilogues is just text, there's no pictures, so we don't really know what he was wearing. All we know is that he was in his early 20s, and then he realized that, welp, this timeline doesn't matter, and then jumped from the bell tower. So I don't know exactly what to say about him, since he just, dies. But so I'll take this opportunity to, I guess, kind of touch upon his relationship with Jake, since I've already touched upon his relationship to Dave and Rose, kind of. So I mentioned this briefly when I was drawing Jake, but I feel like him and Dirk have a very push and pull kind of relationship. Again, I know there's a lot of discourse in the fandom, like who's the victim and who's the perpetrator in this relationship, which I always think that discussion is kind of dumb. I've seen it in a lot of other fandoms where there's a couple that is clearly doesn't have a great relationship and is kind of toxic, and to me it's clear that like both are in the wrong in different ways, but people always are arguing like who's wrong and who's right. So let me set the record straight when it comes to what I think about this. So I think that Dirk and Jake are kind of, when they're on and off as they are like in the epilogues and, well, kind of the beginning of Earthsea, right? They're kind of described as being like on and off. I feel like they're kind of playing this game of cat and mouse, right? I don't think they're actually like in love with each other, as in romantically, like, oh, I want to hold his hand and I want to stroll on the beach with him, I think they're both obsessed with each other, unhealthily so, in different ways. I think Dirk is obsessed with Jake, all that he is. Like, obviously I think he finds him attractive, but besides that, I think Dirk finds his own attraction to him intriguing, because again, Dirk is one of those people that feels like he knows himself so incredibly well, and Jake is so different from him. Jake follows orders. He doesn't like to think for himself that hard. He likes for other people to think for him and lead him in certain directions, and then he basically blames them when he ends up in a bad place and stuff like that. And I think that fascinates Dirk, because Dirk is so self-assured and so like, this is the road I'm supposed to go, and I think he kind of hates the thought of other people controlling him. He wants to control other people, so I think Jake being very receptive to that control is very intriguing to him. Meanwhile, I think Jake is very into Dirk, in the sense that he thinks he's like an adventurer. He loves adventures and challenges, and Dirk is a challenge and an adventure for him, I think. And that's why I think they're very on and off, because I think they kind of break up, they fight, and then when they've been apart for a little while, it's like it would be an adventure to get back together again, and then Jake maybe crawls back to Dirk, and Dirk's like, nah man, I don't want you, and then Jake finds that even more intriguing, and then they play cat and mouse, and then Dirk gets interested because of that, and then Jake is like, no, I'm done with this. That's my headcanon anyway, that they kind of just go back and forth, get tired of each other, get some distance, are on again, and then gets tired, get off again. I think it's this very unhealthy obsession and kind of almost addiction to the thrill it gives them both, but there's no like genuine concern and care there. It's more so an obsession with how the other person is. Obviously, a lot of people might disagree with this take, but that's my take. um, but anyway, I basically put Dirk in the outfit he has when he's Brain Ghost Dirk, or at least it's inspired by that outfit. And I also think it's funny because this outfit is so basic and it's so similar to the outfit he wore as a teenager that it's just kind of funny to look at this version of him and his teenage version beside each other because they're just so similar. But yeah, that's all the Dirks. So now that we've gone through them, we are going to go through the beta kids one by one. And as previously mentioned, I already drew the beta kids last video, so I'll quickly show those designs on screen, and then I will draw them in the Meat and Candy timelines. So yeah, let's get going to that. So now we are moving on to the Meat timeline, John Egbert. Now, like the other beta kids, I drew John in my last video. I think he turned out very cute. But for the Meat timeline, I had some difficulty knowing how to draw him because, well, he dies pretty early on in his 20s, sadly. And so I was like, okay, I'll just have to draw him how he's described before his death, I guess. Not impaled and everything, but before he went on the mission that ultimately ended up killing him, essentially. So I drew him in his god tier outfit, since that's what he wore to the mission. And I drew him a little more like thin and pale than I would have if he was healthy. But we know that John was sadly rather depressed before he passed away, and he hadn't really gone outside in a long while, and he wasn't really properly taking care of himself. So I'm just kind of picturing that he was a little bit like thin and pale and just depressed, which is very sad because I really like John and he's usually such a cheerful character, so it's just so sad that he had to go through that. Also, there's something else that I feel that I should address, and that is the headcanon of June Egbert. A lot of people headcanon John as a trans woman named June, and I have nothing against that headcanon whatsoever. However, I do see some people say it's canon, and I would say in Beyond Canon we are given a quick glimpse of June upon the request of fans, and that might imply that that might become canon and that John might change his identity. And if that happens, that's all fine and dandy. Obviously, if it happens, I'll use all the right pronouns, the right name, everything. But it hasn't happened yet. Up until this point, John has only used the name John and has only used the pronouns he, him that we know of. And so that's how I will refer to him. Again, if that ever changes in the future within Beyond Canon, I'll obviously adhere to that. But just so you guys know that I'm not against the June headcanon at all whatsoever. I just don't use June and she, her because, well, John hasn't used that name or that pronouns in the Beyond Canon yet, so. But anyway, I don't have that much to say about, John's strong qualities and his weaknesses and flaws or whatever in this timeline, because again, he dies very early on, and I feel like stuff like his relationship to Roxy and his relationship to Teresi and stuff like that, that becomes much more of a bigger thing in the Candy timeline, and so I think I'll save that discussion until then. Except obviously I can bring up the fact that he and Teresi did sleep together, and that he did confess his feelings to her before dying, and the fact that Teresi has been out in space all this time, and her age and his age have increased at different speeds. I don't know, basically, Jareesi's been outside of canon or outside in space, which means that she ages way slower than everyone on Earthsea. And so it's very dubious what her age is and whether she was actually of age when her and John slept together. And there's a lot of little weird details like that in the epilogues and beyond canon, and I feel like some of them were thought through and some of them was the result of the creators just not thinking about what age the characters were and just kind of assuming that they were all the same age, but they were not, and so some of the scenes are just really weird. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I just wanted to bring that up, that is something that I noticed, and yeah, that is also part of the reason why I didn't want to talk about Jane's relationship with Gamzee, because obviously Gamzee was probably not of age when they started hooking up, and I just don't want to talk about it. It's a whole mess. I don't know why they put it in there, and I don't like it. It's one of the things that I dislike the most about the epilogues and beyond canon. Like, I do like the epilogues and beyond canon. Hot take, I know. But the age stuff is one of the things that I feel like they didn't think through, and a lot of it I think is a result of them just not keeping track of the characters' ages when they're in different timelines and stuff like that, and that kind of sucks because the result is questionable. But yeah, anyway, here is Meet John. He's depressed, he's sad, he's dead. I feel sorry for him. So let's move on. So Candy John is obviously older. I have to say that. I have to point this out, actually. In the Candy timeline, the time has progressed further than in the Meat timeline. So in the Candy timeline, the characters are about like 40-ish, and I know that they are basically immortal gods, and so they shouldn't be aging that much, but when I draw the characters from the Candy timeline, I do draw them a little bit older than I draw them in the Meat timeline, because I feel like just because you're immortal, why would your aging stop at specifically like 20, you know? Like, I understand the thought that your aging would stop before the age of your health declining because of age, but I do feel like there are other factors that factor into you aging except for time, like circumstance, emotions, stress, all of that. So in my opinion, all of those factors like stress and the environment, and most of them being parents and stuff like that, I feel like that would age them a little bit physically, like in their appearance. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. That's why I've drawn the characters like looking a little older in the Candy timeline, because they are. So yeah. But anyway, John. Here we can really talk about John's flaws. So the thing with John for me is that he has this issue where he's kind of like Jake, which understandable, they are related. But I would say Jake has this thing where he is smart and he understands when he's hurting people, he understands what he's doing wrong, but he pretends not to understand it because he doesn't want to deal with it. Meanwhile, I would say John genuinely doesn't understand. I'm not saying John is dumb, but maybe a little bit. He might be a little bit naive. I feel like a lot of the time people explain things to him and he genuinely doesn't understand. I don't think he pretends not to understand. I think he genuinely does not understand. And the thing is, he wants people to tell him what to do all the time. Like, for example, when in the beginning of Homestuck, when he was about 13 and he first started chatting with Riska, and Riska basically made him kill himself in timeline, and he just did it without questioning it, pretty much. He wants to follow other people's orders. He wants people to tell him what to do because he doesn't want, like similarly to Jake, he doesn't want to have to think about it. I think Jake's flaw, again, is that he understands what he needs to do, he understands what he's doing wrong, but he doesn't want to do anything to fix it. I think in John's case, John doesn't understand what he's doing wrong. He doesn't understand what to do to make it better, and he doesn't put in the effort to find out either. He just wants people to explain to him and basically just say, do this, without any further explanation, and he'll just do it because he doesn't want to have to find out and think for himself. So he's kind of similar to Jake in that sense, in my opinion anyway. And I think this is what happens with John and Roxy's relationship. I think John mentions that he doesn't feel like anything is happening within the relationship. He doesn't feel like Roxy challenges him, essentially. He mentions that they never yell at him, they never fight. Roxy just kind of agrees with everything he says, or if they don't say anything. And obviously that plays into Roxy's character as well, where Roxy doesn't want to go against their friends or their family. They don't want to disagree, which is their problem, obviously. But I think John's problem is that, like, Roxy didn't order him around enough for his liking. Not in a sexual way or anything, but like in a personal way. Like, he wants to be told what to do. He wants someone to challenge him and change his views and tell him, no, you're doing this wrong, do this instead. Which is why I think he's drawn to both Riska and Teresi, because they're both characters that are kind of barky and like to tell other people what to think and that they're wrong and stuff like that. And I think he's kind of drawn to that. And I think this is also what drives John to be a very absent father, where he basically leaves his son at 5 years old and then just seemingly never meets up with him again until he's a teen, which is just so sucky. Fuck you, John. But I think that flaw of John's is the leading cause of that outcome. I think he didn't feel like Roxy was telling him how to parent, and so he was just like, I'm not gonna parent, you know? Like, he did this whole big thing where he tried to essentially kidnap Jake and Jane's child, to free him from an abusive situation, and his wife finds him out, and they don't yell at him, they don't do anything like that, and so he just leaves, because I think he very much, with that stunt, he expected Roxy, at the very least, to be very mad at him, but I think they were mainly just disappointed and didn't want to yell at him in front of a bunch of people and all of that junk, so he just left because Roxy wasn't giving him what he wanted. They didn't give him, like, a challenge, instructions, anything. And that's not an excuse. I think John is a terrible person for just leaving the situation like that and not stepping up and trying to be, at the very least, there for his son. But, you know, this is what I'm talking about. I think all of these characters, the character traits they have in Homestuck, I think it makes sense how they turn out in Beyond Canon. And yes, some of them do go a little extreme, because I think some of them are truly the summit of, like, all of their flaws, and it's just pushed to the most extreme thing possible. But I see a lot of people saying that, you know, Beyond Canon and then the epilogues are so insanely out of character, and I just don't agree with that. And I know that's a hot take, but that's just what I think. I think a lot of the things they go through as children and a lot of the traits they exhibit as children, it makes sense that they would develop into this thing that it does as they're adults in Beyond Canon. But yeah, now I've talked over the time a little bit, so let's move on. Okay, and now we have reached Jade. Meet Jade, specifically. And Meet Jade is my favorite version of Jade between the two timelines, I think, for obvious reasons. Mainly because she seems to be doing pretty good. She seems to have made her way from a bad place in her life to a better place, and I applaud her for that. I think with Jade, her issue has always been loneliness, you know? She grew up alone on an island, her grandpa was dead, then they play Spurb, and in the timeline that ends up, I suppose, fused with the one they're currently in, I think, she spends years alone, um, because John in that timeline died, and Dave Sprite in that timeline also died. And then, they get to Earthsea, everyone is reunited, and she spends so much time with kind of just being young and like sleeping around with people and experimenting, but never really finding her footing. And then she tries to get together with Dave and Karkat, who clearly doesn't want to. And I think at that point, she has just dealt with so much death and loneliness and loss, and has just never had anything actually stable in her life that, like, despite, I think, her understanding that Dave and Karkat didn't want to be with her, I think she still pushed because she was so desperate to have something stable and something that's, like, for her. And this is not me defending that behavior. I think she definitely realized that she was making them uncomfortable and that they didn't want to be with her. And obviously, at that point, it's not okay to push. Obviously, I think it's not okay for Dave and Karkat to not, say no outright either. I'm gonna get to that later when I'm talking about them. But yes, I think she's definitely in the wrong for pushing it like that. But I also feel like I have to acknowledge that it is obviously a result of a lifetime of loneliness and a desperation to find some sort of footing, And that's what I really like about Homestuck characters, because they're also multifaceted, I would say. They all have reasons for the things they do, but that doesn't always mean that the things they do are the right things to do, But yeah, as I mentioned, now that she's on the ship with the others, pursuing Dirk in the Meat timeline, she feels and looks way happier. I think she's found a bit of a community on this ship, and she's spending time with friends. They want to spend time with her. I think she has found belonging outside of romantic relationships. And honestly, I love that. I love that for her. I'm not opposed to her getting together with someone in the future or anything, but I feel like at this point, because she has dealt with so much death, so much loss, she has been so focused on finding community and finding a home, essentially. I think she's focused that desperation and that need for something into romantic relationships, and it hasn't quite worked out. So I think now that she's found her footing kind of with the crew on the ship, I think she might discover things about herself more and focus and work a bit more on herself. And then eventually, when she's done that and maybe she feels ready to get into a romantic relationship, she can. But I think, moral of the story, I think it's great that she has worked on herself, or she seems to be working on herself on the ship, and she seems way happier, and she seems to just be having a good time with the others, Because the thing is, I really like Jade. I think she's always been really cute and really bouncy, and I love her personality. And I think, again, her biggest flaw is this immense sense of loneliness that has always followed her. I mean, I know her section in Pester Quest, the game, was literally called the loneliest girl in the world. And so seeing her kind of thrive on the ship with a community is just really great, in my opinion. And it's interesting because for some of the characters in Homestuck Beyond Canon, they have these two timelines. They're like in bad places in both of them. Meanwhile, I think characters like Jade are really good examples of characters that are kind of pushed into a good place in one of the timelines and then pushed into a bad place in the other one, which we'll obviously get to in a moment. But as for her design, I really like how she turned out. I think she's really cute. I like her little almost party girl outfit. And I love the detail that like there's a little Beck head like by her waist. I think it's really cute. I gave her a little bit of a wolf cut, I think you could call it, which obviously kind of funny because since she's half dog. And yeah, I think this and the version I drew where she's 13 at the beginning of Spurb, I think those two are my favorites. But yeah, let's move on to the Candy timeline. So now we're gonna talk about Candy Jade. Now, obviously, I don't love Jade in Candy, but I do love that they did this with her character because I feel like it is so incredibly accurate to her struggles with loneliness and the kind of desperate measures it could genuinely push her to. So in Candy, obviously, she still put pressure on like Dave and Karkat eventually left because, you know, Dave wouldn't stand up for him or stand up to her or anything. And so Jade and Dave end up together. I'll talk more about this in Dave's part of the video because I feel like it's even more relevant to his character. But yeah, so anyway, Jade and Dave end up together and eventually married. And at least in the epilogues, it's very clear that this isn't a happy marriage. And it's also very apparent that Jade wants children and Dave doesn't. And I don't think Jade wants children because she's always wanted to be a mother and it's like a big dream of hers. Like, maybe it is, but I don't think that's the main reason. I think the main reason is she wants a child so that she can feel less lonely. And that is never a good reason to have a child. A child isn't supposed to be some companion that you can use for your mental health. A child isn't supposed to be like a replacement for other social interactions or some like you shouldn't create a person just to create a sense of belonging, right? Having children should always come from a place of like unselfishness and just wanting a child and being willing to take care of that child. You know, it shouldn't be for some like ulterior motive or anything. But anyway, I think Jade is just so lonely, especially in this marriage where Dave, in my opinion, he doesn't love her. Not the way he should as her husband anyway. And I think she feels very lonely in this marriage, and so she seeks her sense of belonging somewhere else. Obviously, we're gonna talk about Yiffy now. So what ends up happening even before her and Dave get married, I think, is that Jade and Rose decide to both cheat on their respective partners and have sex and conceive a child together, which then, if I've understood it correctly, Jade takes care of and parents in secret. Yeah. And obviously we'll get to this part in Rose's part as well and talk about why I think she did it, but for Jade, it's very obvious that she did it out of pure, like, desperation and loneliness. And, you know, I think she saw with Dave that they weren't gonna have any children, and so she was like, but I have to have a child. Like, I think this was truly what she thought was her only way to find any semblance of, like, belonging, which is obviously incredibly sad. I think similarly to characters like Jane, which, you know, is her biological mother, so it makes sense. Similar to Jane, I think this is Jade pushed to her absolute worst. Nothing is really working with her, and so instead of kind of stepping back and trying to look at her life and trying to look into herself, she keeps seeking belonging and seeking relief for her loneliness, and that just leads her to make really rash and bad decisions. So, you know, I kind of hate to see the place where Jade is at in this timeline. She's, you know, she's really, I think, stressed. She is still lonely, I'm sure. And, you know, her husband has died. This affair she's had like 15 years ago really just comes to the surface, and everything is just a mess. And it's just, yeah. She also has this really big fight with John where, you know, he criticizes her actions and she can't really handle it. Yeah, it's very apparent that the characters in the Candy timeline, they're just generally not in a good place at all, Jade included. Also, sorry if you hear noises, it's raining very heavily outside my window. I can't really do anything about that.
So, fun fact, it was actually raining because of a storm.
and the storm's name was Dave. So do with that what you will. But yeah, anyway, conclusion. I think I really like that they did this with Jade's character because I do feel like it's something that could happen to her, based on who she is and her history and her issues with loneliness and stuff like that. But I also hate to see her this way, because I do like her, and I don't want to dislike her, but I cannot like this version of her because obviously she has made some really bad decisions and she could have pretty easily gotten herself out of it, but she just chose not to do it. And I think that's the case with a lot of these characters. They refuse to kind of work on themselves and challenge themselves when it comes to their insecurities and fears and flaws and everything, and that just leads them to a really bad place. And then they always end up asking like, oh my god, how did I end up here? And it's like, well, but I think that's also really good character writing because that happens all the time in real life. And I think a lot of people who are like middle-aged end up looking at least some aspect of their life going like, I wish I did that differently, So yeah, let's move on. So next up is Meet Dave. And I can already feel myself laughing a bit because I feel like no one okay, not no one, but I feel like few people will maybe agree with my opinions on this version of Dave. But I really love Meet Dave. I'm not gonna lie to you. And like, sure, you can blame it all on me being a big Dave cat shipper. You definitely can if you want to. But I swear to God, it's not just because they're together in this timeline. It really isn't. I just genuinely feel like Meet Dave is one of the best possible versions of Dave. And I know I've seen so much hate on him in the fandom, where people comment on the fact that they think he's completely out of character, they think he's way too relaxed, he's like boring, he's so boring that he was written out of Beyond Canon for a little while, etc, etc. And I just couldn't agree less, I don't think Dave is out of character in the Meet timeline at all. And I think the only reason why you find him boring is because his issues aren't as prominent anymore. I think Dave as a character has always been driven very harshly by his fears and his insecurity. His, like, I would say hallmarks as his character is that he always tries to play very, very smooth. He always tries to have this really cool persona, and he always fails miserably because he just ends up rambling instead because of his insecurities. When he gets uncomfortable, he rambles and he starts talking about really weird shit because that makes everyone else around him uncomfortable, and then he's not the only uncomfortable one anymore, and he finds comfort in that. Now, in the Meet timeline, Dave has been pushed by Dirk to actually finally confess his feelings for Karkat, which has been like a long fucking time coming. He's just been too much of a coward to do it before, because I am a firm believer that they've been in love since the comet, and neither one has just been able to make a move, But he finally does, and he and Karkat ends up together, and they seem really happy together. And I think that's what happens on the ship. On the ship, we see glimpses of Dave, usually in relation to Karkat. And, they're both they seem to be in a happy relationship. Dave is, unusually calm. He doesn't ramble as much. He still rambles, but he doesn't ramble as much. And he doesn't do much. He just kind of walks around and lives his life. And I think that's where people compare him to how he was during Spurb when he was doing all these cool stunts and he was like playing it really cool, and then they compare it to this grown-up version of Dave in the Meet timeline that's just lacing around with his boyfriend on this ship, and they think this is so out of character, this is Dave Cat slop, basically. But the thing is, I don't think it's out of character at all. I think genuinely this is kind of who Dave is as a person. This is just the first time he's ever been comfortable enough to let it show. I think at like the core of things, Dave is a very chill guy, like genuinely, and I think he gets that from Roxy because I think Roxy's a very chill guy, you know? Roxy's always been kind of no bullshit, take it easy, and yeah, sure, he can get really excited sometimes and stuff like that, but I think generally Roxy's a pretty calm person, and I think that's why he and Calliope, go so well together. And I think that's part of Dave too, but he's never been able to show that because he was trained by Bro from a very young age to always be on his tippy toes, always be aware, always be like masculine and cool. Like Dirk's, or Bro's in this case, it's the same person, different universes, but I think his visions of like how a man should be and how you should be as a person has really seeped into Dave. But now that he's older and he's in a relationship that is very stable and he's with people that he feels comfortable with, he can finally be himself. And I think he just genuinely is a very just chill guy. So I personally love this version of Dave. I think he's finally able to relax after literally his entire life of like being tense constantly and just hiding and masking and all of that stuff. And I think now he can finally just relax and be himself. And it kind of annoys me how people are immediately like, Chud. Like people are immediately like, this isn't my Dave. This is not my hashtag not my Strider. Because I genuinely feel like Jade, he's in a good place in his life and he's improving. And obviously he still has flaws. Like he's still very bad at, standing up for himself. And I'm sure there's a lot of things he needs to work on, like just like all the others. But I think he's in a very good place in his life. And I applaud him for that. I think that's great. But yeah, that being said, let's move on to the Candy timeline. So, in the Candy timeline, Dave is a robot. Yeah. So, essentially, Dave in the epilogues explained that we're going to talk about his sexuality right now. So, bear with me. I know people have a lot of split opinions on this too, and I'm going to give my 5 cents. So, in the Meet timeline, in the epilogues, Dave describes himself as bisexual quite fleetingly. He seems a bit unsure about it still, but that's how he labels himself anyway. And as we know, in the Meet timeline, he ends up with Karkat. In the Candy timeline, he never does end up with Karkat because Dirk, who is the ultimate pusher for it to happen, is dead. So he ends up married to Jade. As previously mentioned, quite unhappily married. And things happen, and years down the line, he ends up in a crypt with Obama. And he confesses to Obama that he thinks he's gay because he's not in love with Jade and he still thinks about Karkat. And because of this revelation, he decides to kill himself and become a robot, essentially. Local 40-year-old man meets Obama, realizes he's gay, kills himself, and becomes a robot, basically. So, yeah. So, Dave becomes his quote-unquote ultimate self. He becomes a robot that is a culmination of, I think, all of his previous selves from different timelines, if I'm not incorrect. So he is supposedly knows everything about himself in this form. But obviously, he abandons Jade and all his friends and everything and becomes a robot. And he goes off in a ship with Aradia and like ghost dead 13, Jade, Kanaya. Okay, we've lost the plot. He goes off on some sort of space mission in this universe too, is what I'm trying to say. And obviously, this version of Dave, in my opinion, isn't the best. I think all of his self-doubt and all of his insecurities have just pushed him so far in a direction where he didn't want to be, that he just ends up giving up. Like, he literally kills himself, and becomes this robot where he becomes a fake version of himself that knows everything and is self-assured and everything. But except the one scene where we've seen him as a robot, he talks to Aradia and he's very clearly projecting his insecurities onto her. She even points it out in the scene. And so obviously, despite becoming this ultimate version of himself that knows everything about himself, he's still insecure. So I think this version of him is really just supposed to represent his insecurities, just completely taking over him and winning, essentially. And this is where I want to talk about his sexuality. It isn't the sole contributor to him having really bad self-esteem and having a lot of identity issues and stuff like that. Obviously, it isn't. But it's a big part. Because I think Dirk has a very narrow view of masculinity and how you're supposed to be a man, and how you're supposed to act when you're a man. It's very apparent both in Homestuck but also in the epilogues where he is the narrator. The way he narrates and the way he commentates about what the other characters are doing makes it really clear that he has very harsh mindset when it comes to gender, when it comes to identity, like how you're supposed to be. He is very into like hyper masculinity, and I think Bro probably has at least some of these views as well, since, well, it is him and another the universe. And I think these views have really rubbed off on Dave, and so he is so convinced that like being gay is not a sin, but it's like a really shameful thing. It's something that real men isn't, you know? And I think that's why he's so shocked when he realizes Dirk is gay, or at least queer in Homestuck, because he's like, well, my bro basically taught me that this is something you shouldn't be, you know? And that's why, in my opinion, I think Dave is gay. I know a lot of people headcanon him as bisexual, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I'm not biphobic. I am bisexual myself. But I think Dave is gay because I think the reason he says he's bisexual in the epilogues at a first glance is because he simply hasn't explored that part of himself that much. He knows he's in love with Karkat, and I don't think he knows much more than that, and that's completely okay. But I do think this moment where he's been married to Jade, and he's missing Karkat, and I think when he says like, I think I'm gay, I believe him. Like, I think he is too. And whether he realized that in the Me timeline or not, maybe it doesn't even matter, because, you know, he's in a happy relationship. He seems to be content where he is. So, but I personally think Dave is gay, and I think in the Me timeline he comes to terms with that, or at least with the fact that he's queer, and he's fine with it. And in the Candy timeline, he very much does not. I could talk about this for hours. Dave is one of my favorite characters, and I love the way he's written, but obviously I can't for this video, so let's move on. Now we're going to talk about the last human for this video, and ironically enough, she's not a human in this timeline. It is Rothaland. Now in the Me timeline, similar to Dave in the Candy timeline, she basically gives up her body and becomes this all-knowing god robot thing. Except I would say in the Candy timeline with Dave, it is, although his robo self is obviously was obviously pushed onto him by Dirk, but in a very much like more indirect way, since Dirk is already dead there. Rose is very like hands-on, pushed into this role by Dirk. So essentially, she's a seer of light. And as a seer, she gets these visions sometimes, of other realities and stuff like that. And essentially, she is struck with this illness, they call it, where she receives very powerful visions of other universes and things that are to come. And essentially, they describe it as different versions of her from different universes just kind of crashing in on her, and her regaining all of those memories and all of that knowledge, and her body not really being able to handle it. So basically, she becomes very sick because of her aspect. And Dirk has experienced the same thing, except he could handle it a little better because I think he has dealt with it for longer, and also his aspect is heart, and I think, you know, he knows himself very well, so I think he's just, because of all of those things, he's just able to handle it a little better, and he doesn't get as sick. But essentially, in her sick state, he convinces her that she should become a robot, and she can't really protest because she's very sick, and also Dirk is able to control people. And also, on top of that, honestly, I do believe that Rose would do this if she believed it was the right thing to do. So, I think the question of what Rose does voluntarily versus what Dirk makes her do is very complicated in this timeline, because the thing about Rose is I think she's very similar to Dirk. I think, this is my opinion, and I think Roxy and Dave are more similar, and Dirk and Rose are more similar. And while Dirk can be very cold and uncaring and pretty much only like prioritizes his own development and like what he's supposed to be as a person, I do think Rose is a little bit more like, she does care about, you know, her wife Kanaya and like their friends and everything, but I think similarly to Dirk, she also prioritizes if she finds something like something related to destiny or canon that is supposed to be, I think she does prioritize making that happen as well. And I think she's very much one of these people where she's like, well, I had to do this morally bad thing, and I didn't want to do it, but it will cause this thing to happen, and that's more important than everyone's feelings about this thing I did. You know, she can also be very cold and analytical, and I think that's just a part of both Rose and Dirk, and it's something that they both need to work on, but they won't. And I'm saying this, basically this theory that Rose isn't entirely controlled by Dirk here, and she's also controlled by her own actions. I base that a lot on the other universe that we'll talk about in a moment, the Candy universe, where, you know, this sickness, so to speak, disappears, but despite her not being controlled by Dirk, she still does some pretty heinous things, purely because she can, pretty much. Like, she does it because she sees that it would fulfill a purpose, or because she sees like, well, this thing will happen in the future, so it doesn't matter if I do this thing or if it hurts people around me, because this thing will happen. She's a very like logical, analytical, and cold person at times, and I think that that reigns over emotion and empathy a lot for her. And I think honestly this is present in original Homestuck as well. I think she often prioritizes the game and how it's supposed to be played, instead of prioritizing the safety of her friends, or like being worried about her. Like, she does care about her friends, but I think if she was put in a situation where she would have to choose between doing something that would further the game and be good for the game and the plot, essentially, versus you know, being kind or helping someone, she would do the thing that would further the plot and would like develop things more, if you catch my meaning. It's really hard to explain, so I can't tell if I'm making myself clear at all, but essentially I'm saying that, like Dirk, Rose can be very cold and analytical, and if she's doing something that she thinks is good, she will trample over people to achieve that. And I think, although that I do think Dirk does control her choice of becoming a robot, I think she is also in charge of that decision. Like, I think she would make that decision even if she wasn't sick eventually, because she would see the benefits of it. But yeah, let's move on to the Candy timeline. So, Rose is clearly going through a rough patch. Her entire life is a rough patch in Beyond Canon, and low-key, it's all on her. So, basically, in the Candy timeline, Rose overwins her sickness. She doesn't receive all these visions anymore, I think, but she still knows some stuff about the future, so I don't really know how that works, but whatever. Basically, she decides to actually stay with her wife, Kanaya, and they adopt a grub together, which for some reason is a reincarnation of her wife's previous crush, but let's not talk about that. So essentially, in Beyond Canon, the Candy timeline is considered not canon, or like it doesn't go according to what's supposed to happen in canon, whatever the fuck that means, you know. And Rose knows this, and so she decides to just like live her life, and I think she does seem content with that to a point, right? I think she's happy to be with her wife and to have a child with her and to just kind of have the life she has. But I think, like Dirk, Rose has an intense urge to be relevant. And in the Candy timeline, she is very well aware that this isn't a canon timeline anymore, and that she's not actually relevant anymore. And she also knows that she will get shot in the head and die at the age of 40-something. And so I think what happens is she basically decides, F it. And she decides to sleep with Jade and help her get a child, cheating on both of their partners in the process. So Rose gets pregnant with Jade's child. She has it, and then Jade basically raises it in secret. And this is just a secret between them, essentially. And from what I understand, Rose isn't very present in Yiffy's life, like, at all. And I don't think that was the plan either. I think the plan was just for Jade to raise the child. I don't know. It's all just very muddled and weird and confusing, and I think it's genuinely... I like Yiffy as a character, but I think her existence and the process of it coming to be is one of the biggest flaws in the Epilogues and Beyond Canon. It clearly wasn't very well thought out. But basically, my interpretation of this is that Rose slept with Jade to give her a child for the plot, essentially. I think she realizes that this isn't the canon. I can do whatever I want here. It won't matter. And I'll die later anyway. So it's like, I think she just kind of has this intense urge to stay relevant, to do something that is going to have an impact, and she knows probably that Yiffy will maybe be part of the future Spurb game played on Deltrius, or not on Deltrius, but, you know, from Deltrius. I don't know, man, with the characters that are on Deltrius. And so I think this is a very good example of Rose. I think she does care about Kanaya, she does care about her friends, but if betraying Kanaya, sleeping with someone else, doing all these shady fucking things, if that means she'll be more plot relevant, if that contributes to something bigger, she's fine with doing it, even though she knows it will hurt Kanaya. And as she says, she's like, well, I know you will forgive me anyway, so it doesn't matter. I would compare this a little bit to Sapphire in Steven Universe, even though obviously Sapphire is a lot nicer than Rose is in this instance. But Sapphire can see into the future, for those who don't know, and that's her power. And because she can see into the future, she tends to not be very good in the moment and not very empathetic in the moment when she's having fights and arguments with people, because she can see into the future that, well, this will all get solved, so whatever. And obviously because of that, she comes off as very cold and just like she doesn't care, which might worsen the argument anyway. And I think this is kind of what happens to Rose too. She has all these visions, she has all this knowledge of what will happen in the future, and so instead of being in the present and trying to be like, okay, these things will happen, but I should focus on my family, I should focus on my wife, I shouldn't betray my wife, she just accepts them, and she's like, well, I have to work towards this goal no matter the cost, essentially. And that's my theory anyway of like why Rose has done what she has done. So Rose and Beyond Canon, she's a mess, honey. And I do think that fits her character, because obviously this mindset of like, I'm gonna do whatever it takes to reach this goal no matter who I hurt, that's not gonna be good for you in the long run. And I think I do really like how in the recent updates of Beyond Canon, Candy Rose has just really gotten her ass handed to her. She's gotten humbled so hard when she wasn't shot in the head like she thought she would be, and she's just kind of like, oh my god, I fucked up my life. You know, she just has this life flashing before her eyes realization, and I think she really needed that, and I think she really deserved that. I love Rose as a character, so yeah, I could talk about her for a long time too, but not in this video. Let's move on. Now we're getting into the two trolls I'm gonna draw. I'm gonna draw Karkat, and I'm gonna draw Kanaya, because they are very, like, relevant to the story right now. And I know there are more trolls, like, for example, Teresi and Riska, that are also relevant to the story, but they came in a little later, and I feel like their designs are a little harder to pinpoint between the timelines, so I'm not going to do them for this video. Might in a future video, we'll see. But anyway, here is Karkat Vanta's meet meet in the meet timeline. So similar to Dave, I do really like Karkat in this timeline. I'm really happy to see him seemingly kind of thriving a bit and feeling a bit better. I think with Karkat, the issue, or I shouldn't say issue, but like his biggest flaw and his biggest challenge in life has always been like accepting himself. I think he and Dave are very similar in a lot of ways, but at the same time not. Because I think Dave's biggest struggle is with him always having to be on guard, and him trying to be what his bro thought a man should be, which gave him issues with his personality and his sexuality and everything. I think with Karkat, he has always struggled with feeling like an outcast and feeling like he's wrong. Not only because of his blood color, obviously that plays a big part, but I think also Karkat doesn't really seem to be into quadrants in the same way other trolls are, and I think that's also a big contributor. And I also think that Karkat feels really lost in his role as a leader that he's constantly put into, which ironically I think makes him a very good leader, because a leader is supposed to be, you know, selfless and caring about people. And he really is. I think he makes a great leader. And I think that's the biggest flaw, I think, with Meet Karkat. Because Meet Karkat never really gets to be put into that position. I think he is supposed to be a leader, even against his own will. I think that is where he would thrive the most, in my opinion. But in the Me timeline, he's kind of stuck in this ship with people. So although I think he's really happy in his relationship with Dave, and he seems to have accepted himself, and that makes me really happy, I think he also has a greater purpose that is yet to be realized. But obviously, it may come later. But like with Dave, I am really happy to see him be more confident and being able to laugh with people, being able to wear shorts. That sounds weird, but I know that for, like, in Homestuck, it was a very big thing where Karkat tried to cover himself up as much as possible and, like, try to disappear into the background as much as possible and try to, make, instead of, like, people staring at him because he was a freak, he tried to, like, he was very loud and noisy, because I think then he felt like, well, if I can make him stare, then I'm in control, kind of. Meanwhile, here in the Me timeline, he seemed way happier. He isn't as yelly, screechy as he usually is, because I think he can, like Dave, relax a lot more because he's comfortable in his relationship with Dave, and he's comfortable with the people there around on the ship. And that makes me really happy to see. It really does. I think him and Dave are really cute together, obviously, but I also really like, it seems that Karkat has kind of found friendship in other people too, like in Calliope and in Jake, and I think that's really fun, and I would very much love to see more of that. But yeah, I'm just really glad to see, like, Karkat basically just living his best life and being comfortable, and I hope for big things to come for him. Also, regarding the design, I know I talk very little about the designs in this video. This is really just an excuse for me to yap about Homestuck. But I made him a little bit chubby, and that's because I'm a chubby Karkat truther. I think when he was a kid, he was a bit skinnier. But as he grows into an adult, I think he turns out chubby or fat or what have it, and I love that. I really love that. I think if it fits him, because I don't think he moves that much. He's living the soft life with his boyfriend. A lot of people, including myself, have experienced, like, gaining weight after getting into a good and healthy relationship. So, in my opinion, that's what happens to him. And then in the other timeline, obviously, he's a bit more ripped, but you can't build muscle without any meat on your bones. So I know a lot of people draw him skinny, and they kind of imply that he's skinny in Beyond Canon, but I don't agree with it. That's all I have to say on the matter. I don't agree with it. But yeah, I don't have that much else to say about Meet Karkat. I think he's in a good place in his life. I think he could reach a higher potential. Yeah, I like him. I think he's cute. Moving on. Now we've reached Candy Karkat, or as he is also called, Commander Karkat. And I think we can all agree he's hot, okay? I think we can all agree he's really hot. I've always liked Karkat, and obviously for, like, all of the comic, he's a child, so no, I did not find him hot, ew. But even later in the epilogues where he's, an adult and he's described, I'm like, in the Me timeline, I think he's cute, but I'm like, in the Candy timeline, girl. So, obviously in the Candy timeline, he ends up giving up on Dave and his bullshit and ends up leaving and to fight Jane and her basically MAGA agenda towards the trolls. And so he helps build a revolution against her as a revolutionary leader. I think, again, against his will. I don't think he ever wanted to be, like, the face of the rebellion, but that's what he became, and I think that's amazing. No matter what he himself thinks, I do think that is, like, the right path for him to be on. And as I mentioned, I think he's a lot better off, like, mentally and feelings-wise in the Me timeline, but I also think in the Candy timeline, I think he is fighting for something that he's really into and he's very passionate about, and I think that is also great. So although he has some other issues in the Candy timeline, and obviously he isn't at the best place in his life, I think that part of him that wants to fight for something that he believes in and wants to lead people and is a good leader, like that part really thrives in the Candy timeline. And that's why I'm kind of hoping for that part to kick in somewhat in the me timeline too, in some sense, because that would just be perfect. But you know, you win some, you lose some, you know. Also, Commander Karkat is together with Mina, which I think is kind of iconic. I know Mina is obviously a problematic character. I don't like her morally, but she does seem very committed to Karkat, like not necessarily in the romantic sense, even just committed as a partner in crime, a supportive friend, like a supportive person. And I think she's what he needed at that point in time. She was there to support him when Dave wasn't. I mean, she even brings it up in the comic, kind of teases him about it a little bit. And again, although I think Karkat isn't at a great place emotionally, he's definitely at a good place when it comes to him, you know, fighting for something good, you know? Really, honestly, I really like that instead of when Dave really just, you know, when Dave and Karkat were separated, instead of them both being shown like, no, these people can't live without one another, they're both depressed, and you know, I really like the fact that Karkat's relationship to their end of their situationship, I guess, that Karkat's reaction was to just rise and focus on something else and actually do something on with his life. Meanwhile, Dave's reaction was to literally just kill himself. I think that says a lot about their characters, because I think Dave, because of his lack of confidence in himself and his insecurities and his fear of like standing up for himself, that ultimately leads him to failure. Meanwhile, Karkat, although he has gone through so much shit before, he's experienced people leaving him, people betraying him before, he's like, well, I'll just have to pick myself up and continue. And I think that's really admirable, and that's something I love about Karkat. And I like that Dave and Karkat are explored individually in this timeline, like separate from each other as well, because although I love them as a pair and I think they fit really well together, I think sometimes in series and stuff, when two characters get together, they're often paired together all the time, and aren't explored that hard on their own. But I think they really nailed that here. Also, in like the recent updates, when, you know, the big fight where everyone, all of like the original gang that's still left in the Candy timeline, which is fighting, and the kids were running off with Riska and everything, he ate that so hard. I just have to say that he called everyone out on their bullshit, and I love that. He's like, I really love that scene overall, because it really shows that when kids are mistreated and aren't giving the proper help and support as children, they grow up to be bad adults. They grow up to be the adults that took care of them in the first place, or didn't take care of them in the first place. And I think Karkat really calls them out on that and says things as they are. I know he really shoots out Jade for like using Dave all this time, and he just calls out everyone for all their bullshit, and I love that. I think, again, I've said this 1,000 times by now, but Karkat isn't like the happiest in this universe, but he's definitely the wisest and like has the best moral compass. I love him. He's definitely the most adult out of all of them in this timeline. So yeah, after all that Karkat glazing, let's move on. So with that, we have reached our last character for this video, Kanaya Miriam. So in the me timeline, Rose dies and becomes a robot and leaves with Dirk and basically just leaves Kanaya behind. And so she goes on this ship to pursue him with her friends. Now you'll notice quite quickly that I drew her in the outfit we first saw her with on the ship. I know she's since changed her outfit, but I chose this outfit for two reasons. One, because I loved it and I thought it was really pretty, and two, because it creates a starker contrast between her in this timeline and in the Meat timeline. Because in this timeline, no, in the Candy timeline, sorry, but in this timeline, she's very I would say she's very, like, she's kind of in grief. She's thinking about her wife. She wants her wife back. That's her goal. She's very sad and almost gentle in her sadness. She does toughen up later on. I think her friends cheer her up a lot, which is nice to see. But it's just this heartbreaking widow-looking version of her, you know? And I think that's the thing, like, with Kanaya, she has had heartbreak throughout her life. She's so tough and so cool. She's also one of my favorite characters. She's so tough, so cool, so resilient. But I think here we get to see her dealing with a failure, or what she considers to be a failure, because Dirk managed to affect her so that she just let Rose go without even trying to fight for her. And I think she feels a lot of shame in that, because she's always been a person to stand on her business and, like, really stand for what she believes for, and tell people what she thinks and fight for her stuff. And I think her being so easily manipulated by Dirk and just letting Rose go, I think that was a huge letdown for her. And I think that's why she's so solemn and just quiet and sad in the beginning of Beyond Canon, because she just feels like she failed her wife. Obviously, she is unaware that Rose probably went with Dirk at least a little bit willingly, and I think it's gonna be really painful to see her find Robo Rose in the state that she is now, because I do think that will happen. But I feel like in the recent updates with Jade talk and everything, she seems to have really kind of picked herself up and is just having fun with the others and all of that. Although I'm sure she's still sad, but she does seem to have a good time as well, and I really love seeing that. It feels like her and Karkat are kind of similar in that way, that she deals with a loss, she's sad about it, and then she just picks herself up and she's like, well, what can I do to try and fix this, and what can I do in the meantime? And that's really admirable, because really, in the face of loss, in the face of a big breakup or something like that, that's really all you can do. You can just pick yourself up and try to live while recovering, you know? And yeah, I really love Kanaya for that, you know? That being said, with me glazing Kanaya, I'm just glazing everyone, oh my god. But that being said, with all her good qualities, I think her biggest flaw as a character is that she has a tendency to put everyone she admires or loves onto a pedestal. I think she very much puts Rose up on a pedestal, and I think that's why she misses all of these behaviors. I know in this timeline she completely misses that Rose is obsessed with the narrative, and I know that is partially because Dirk controls her to kind of just ignore those things and not care about Rose's illness. I think she would very much care about it if it wasn't for him. But I think at the same time that also comes from a place of, like, her always assuming that Rose knows what's going on and that Rose is doing what's best. I think she has this overconfidence in Rose and puts her on a pedestal, and she's like, well, if she did this, it's probably for the best, you know? And I think that really shows later in the Candy timeline, and I'll also continue talking about this in the Candy timeline because it becomes so apparent there. But I think she's always put Rose on a bit of a pedestal even before she even saw her. I mean, the way they met was literally just her reading the logs that Rose had written for the game, and thinking like, oh, this is such an intelligent being, and like immediately just kind of putting her on a pedestal, and like regarding her as someone very intelligent, and I would say more intelligent than Kanaya, even though I don't believe that Rose is more intelligent than Kanaya. I think they're both equally smart. So yeah, I think that's Kanaya's biggest flaw, that she just admires people to a point where she puts them above her, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think she's just so beautiful in this robe. And I think it's so cute that she makes her own clothes and everything, and I just love her. I just love her so much. So yeah. And now we move on to Candy Kanaya, my poor sweet girl. So in the Candy timeline, Rose stays with Kanaya, they adopt a grub together, and then Rose goes and cheats on her and conceives Yiffy at... It can't be that much later than when they got Rissy, but basically her wife cheats on her and she doesn't notice. Her wife gets pregnant for, what was it, 2-3 months, has a baby, she doesn't notice. And obviously parts of this, I mean, she even brings this up, parts of this can be traced back to her being a troll and not understanding human pregnancy, and especially not the kind of pregnancy Rose had, where the baby's like half dog almost, and it's like it's way faster than a normal human pregnancy usually is. But so like you can't fully blame Kanaya for missing it, but I do also think that the reason she doesn't realize Rose has cheated on her and everything is because she has such a blind trust in Rose. And don't get me wrong, you should have trust when it comes to fidelity with your partner. You should be able to feel 100% certain they're not cheating on you, of course. But I do also at the same time think that she probably saw some signs of this happening and just ignored them because she thought, no, Rose knows what she's doing. I'm not, putting myself in her business. She would never do that to me. She's a goddess. I do think she puts Rose on a pedestal, and I do think that ultimately puts her in a bad position, because Rose is, as we previously talked about, Rose will prioritize doing things for the greater good or for the greater narrative over people's feelings. And that's what she ends up doing. She ends up conceiving a child with another person without Kanaya's consent because of the narrative, and she doesn't even care about Kanaya's feelings about it, because she's like, well, I know you will forgive me. That's the thing. Kanaya puts Rose on a pedestal and puts her into this position of, you're perfect, you could do no wrong, and Rose uses that. She does, and it's horrible. It really is horrible. But I think, and I don't think they did this as teens when they were together. I think they were very wholesome when they were together as teens. And I don't think Rose wants to actively hurt Kanaya's feelings, but that's the thing. Her priorities lies with the narrative and to keep herself relevant over her affection for Kanaya, and that's obviously a problem. This is a flaw in Rose that I think they should have both discovered and worked through. But they can't, because Rose regards herself as a god. Like, Rose regards herself as very important, and then Kanaya just affirms that, and that with Rose in particular, it isn't a very good thing, I fear. But, and this makes me so happy, when the whole affair, Yiffy affair, with Rose and Jade has been exposed, at first it looks like Kanaya's about to just be okay with it and just accept it and be like, yeah, it's fine, whatever. But then, slowly, I think as it kind of sets in, she gets angrier and angrier that she's been betrayed. And that makes me really happy. Like, I said this before when I talked about Rose, but Rose really got what was coming to her, and I think she's gonna get even more shit thrown at her in the Candy timeline, as she deserves. And now it's Kanaya's time to prioritize herself, her own feelings and to kind of just be like, well, I do care about you and your feelings, but you've hurt me, and so I'm gonna prioritize myself. I'm gonna prioritize what's important and the narrative importance of things. I feel like she's like the bad bitch in her has just been unlocked. I think in the Candy timeline she really saw when she realized what Rose had done towards her, and that when she realized that Rose just assumed she would forgive her immediately, I think she kind of knocked her off of that pedestal finally. And although I'm really hurt about what Rose did to her and she doesn't deserve it, I think it was also good for her to see that Rose isn't perfect and Rose isn't always going to make the best decisions, and that she should have more self-respect in her relationship and put more pressure on Rose as well. So I think she just kind of knocked Rose off of this pedestal and has realized she's not perfect, she has hurt me, and she will have to face the consequences for that. And that makes me so happy because Kanaya deserves happiness, she deserves to be with someone who respects her, and obviously she deserves someone who can be loyal to her. So whatever may happen in the future in the Canon timeline, I hope that Kanaya is able to stand up for herself and to really just realize that she needs to prioritize herself for once. So yeah, there are all the designs I made for this video. I'm happy with most of them. Again, I don't talk a lot of the designs, about a lot of the designs in this video. I mainly talk about the plot and everything, so yeah, this was really just kind of an excuse for me to talk more about Homestuck. Sorry, not sorry. But I'm very passionate about this series, and I do like the Epilogues and Beyond Canon a lot, despite its flaws. And I'm really excited to see all that it has to bring for all of these characters. But my general consensus that I want to end this video on is, again, I think a lot of the things that happen to the characters make sense for a lot of the characters with flaws and struggles they had in the original Homestuck series. For example, with Jade and her loneliness, it has always been a very prominent theme with her, and I feel like her going to drastic measures to kind of try to dampen that loneliness, it just makes sense for her. And, you know, I think it's the same thing for John, for example, his relationship with Roxy. I think it's very natural for him for that relationship not to work out, because he constantly needs someone to tell him what to do, and Roxy doesn't do that, and so he's faced with, okay, should I try to find my own way, or should I just leave? And he chooses to leave, and he chooses to ignore his issue. And I think that's the thing with a lot of these characters, and that's the thing I love with these characters, that they have these flaws that they refuse to work on, because that's how it is in real life as well, and there's a good chance many of them don't even realize they have these faults and these flaws, because the way they grew up, most of them didn't have a proper figure to look up to, and if they did, they might not have done the best job as a parent, because of circumstances or because whatever. And then they all went through Spurb, and obviously that was a deeply traumatic thing. And I think then it's only natural for them to turn into flawed adults who don't really know how to be proper adults or how to be parents. Like, in my opinion, with all of the things that these characters have been through, and with all of these things that these characters struggle with, I don't think any of them should have become parents, in my opinion. I think they should have just kind of refrained from doing that, and passing anything on, all of the baggage. But of course, many of them decided to do so, because, again, realistically, a lot of people do that, sadly. And I don't know, I just feel like the way all of these characters have developed and the way they act in the Epilogues and Beyond Canon, it's just very realistic. And I know a lot of people think it's out of character because they've changed so much from Homestuck, but really, I just think that's natural. I mean, it's being like 13 to 16 and being like 25 to 40 is very different. You change a lot, and also you have to consider again all of the trauma they went through, Spurb, that will have changed them, um, and all of the circumstances going on in Beyond Canon. I mean, I don't know. Again, I think Beyond Canon and Epilogues definitely have their flaws, no doubt about that. But I think in general, it's amazing. I like, I think so. And if you disagree, that's fine. That's completely fine. Everyone is allowed to have their own headcanons, their own opinions, their own whatever. But this is my general consensus. So, yeah, thank you for watching this video. Good luck to you and have a great life.